Imagine running to Junction City and back a couple times on a night that's black as the ace of spades, and on a road that you have never seen in the daytime and without lights. You will have a pretty good idea of how the night works.
Over there, soldiers of central Wisconsin encounter not only the Great War, but a great change to their global outlook. Just after the turn of the century, Stevens Point and the surrounding areas was around 10,000 people that consisted of farmers, blue-collar businessmen, and families. As a close-knit community, Stevens Point created an ideal atmosphere to raise a family. Central Wisconsin was part of the backbone of the overall economy in Wisconsin with its agriculture and dairy communities. This small-town life would be interrupted by the German aggression and the fighting in Europe. This would produce anticipation among American citizens that would be shared among the central Wisconsin communities. In 1917, the U.S. Congress declared war on the Central Powers in Europe and began to draft citizens to build a fighting force. Central Wisconsin provided the war effort with 1,535 able soldiers. Many of these soldiers wrote home to loved ones describing their war experiences. This war brought together American men like Charles McCready, and these men told the story of the Great War through letters to home. In this film, these letters from World War I are brought to life by present-day veterans. Central Wisconsin's entrance into World War I brought anticipation to those who served. But when these letters to home arrived, the romance of war dwindled into a dark truth. On April 2, 1917, President Woodrow Wilson addressed Congress asking for a declaration of war against Germany. Only a couple of weeks prior, German U-boats, without warning, sank 3 American merchant ships with a heavy loss of American life. 2 days after Wilson's speech, the Senate and the House of Representatives overwhelmingly declared war. However, America wasn't nearly prepared to jump into a world war. In spite of these obstacles, the United States mobilized both its troops and its citizens at lightning speed. The German General Staff had appraised American military strength as being somewhere between Belgium and Portugal. Wilson wouldn't be mocked and confiscated 97 German and Austrian ships in U.S. ports, which were used to transport 40,000 soldiers to Europe. As citizens prepared on the home front, Wilson sent almost 2 million doughboys to Europe. A letter written home from an unknown soldier from Stevens Point wrote,
"The boys in our company are coming right to the front as first-class soldiers. I haven't seen them drill for 3 weeks, but heard officers speak very well of them today. They gave an exhibition before a moving picture machine, and the lieutenant colonel said K Company was the best regiment and that he would use one of our squads as a model for the other companies."
Once the war had been declared, it was necessary to train the troops in ground warfare and also in the ways of aerial battle. Paul F. Collins, and son of Professor and Mrs. J.V. Collins of Stevens Point, wrote of training for battle in the air.
"The bombing courses here are the best in the country, I think. We make the bombs here at the post of plaster, Paris, and gunpowder. And bomber and pilot flying over target drop bombs from 3,000 to 4,000 feet with accuracy that has greatly pleased the officers in charge."
Soldiers wrote with optimism about their service in letters to home. David Weltman, a 26-year-old local of Stevens Point, wrote,
I have just been assigned to Battery E, 340th Field Artillery, Regulars, and feel tickled to get out of the infantry. All of the fellows I know are split into different companies. Tomorrow we will get new equipment and clothes for overseas, for this division will move in a very few days. However, all of us fellows are tickled to go, and only hope you won't worry a bit, for we feel fine. Here's hoping the Americans get there, and I am one of them.
Soldiers were optimistic and eager for active duty during training. This was encouraged by general public and the Red Cross, who made them feel like heroes before shipping out to Europe. According to Weltman,
"The Red Cross was very liberal with us on our way here. At every station, they were there to meet us. At Elkhart, Indiana, they gave us 20 gallons of ice cream, cake, sandwiches, etc. and all the way we were treated royally to cigars, cigarettes, and candy. Crowds were out everywhere, yelling as we passed. We had 502 men on our train, so you can imagine how our bunch yelled. Most of the men were from Wisconsin, representing all parts of the state, and we gave them the Wisconsin yell until we were hoarse. I intend to see some of the Stevens Point boys tonight at the YMCA. I guess we'll take a walk and see the camp while we can.
The optimism started to fade after arriving in Europe for more intensive training.
Well, in fact, every second of our time is taken up. We start drill now at 6:35 a.m. We got our horses and guns and materials last week. I understand we will go to the gun range for practice commencing this week, and that means real work and getting up about 2 bells every morning and late at night.
Organizations such as the YMCA, YWCA, American Library Association, Salvation Army, War Camp Community Service, the Red Cross, and the Knights of Columbus all rallied around the war effort. In fact, Wisconsin residents purchased over $300 million in Liberty bonds during the war.
If you were thinking of sending some Christmas presents, forget it and either give the money to the Red Cross or Salvation Army or buy Liberty bonds.
Wisconsin Industries also played an important part in mobilizing for war. Wisconsin Industries produced trucks, ships, artillery pieces, ammunition, uniforms, and others for the war effort. For instance, the Kissel Motor Company retooled its factory to make trucks for the war effort. Wisconsin shipbuilders altered their designs to construct warships, and Milwaukee-based company Harley-Davidson sent around 20,000 motorcycles overseas. Wisconsin farmers also altered their crop production to support the war by growing potatoes, beans, and wheat. Citizens did their part by holding Meatless Mondays and Wheatless Wednesdays to ration the food supply. Even at the University of Wisconsin, the Women Students War Work Council produced a wartime recipes cookbook to help citizens conserve food. Life on the front is about more than fighting in the trenches. Troops that are on the front lines rotate shifts. They weren't on the front lines 24/7.
There is more excitement here for one thing. Sunday there were 2 ball games, 2 wrestling matches, and 3 boxing bouts. And in the evening, 5 real honest-to-goodness American girls dancing. It sure was good just to look at them. Then last evening, we had a band concert while several airplanes maneuvered over the lines while Fritz's anti-aircraft guns were shooting at them, and one could see the white puffs of smoke as the shells broke in the air.
The troops were not always in battle and did have some relaxation time. Soldiers needed to have somewhat of normal lives while over there, otherwise they might forget what they were fighting for. Wisconsin soldiers were eager to join the war. However, once they were hit with the harsh realities of combat, they realized it was not what they had expected. The uncertainties of war definitely made living on the front a challenge. Among the many difficulties the soldiers endured at the front, the weather played a major role in all areas of life. Rain fell almost constantly, and living in dugout trenches made their environment even more difficult to manage. Carl Jacobs was a 21-year-old from Stevens Point and the son of P.J. Jacobs, founder of what is now Century Insurance. Jacobs wrote,
"Whenever one of the big fellows shows up, we have beautiful weather. They don't see the mud. Should have one come every day, and perhaps this would not be such a bad place to live in."
These conditions affected both day-to-day living and combat situations, and had a devastating effect when combined with a feature weapon of the Great War, toxic gas. Weather was not the only hardship the young men had no control over. Usually the barracks were poorly constructed, as they would need to be set up and taken down in a hurry. They provided little to no shelter from gas or shells, and also invited unwelcomed visitors.
"The rats have been bothering us of late, so we decided to make a killing today. Have about 100 German guns here that they left and enough ammunition to supply an army so we can bang away all day."
The troops didn't find much comfort in the mess hall either, because the food was unappetizing. The basic bread and dried fruit did not appeal to the men on the front line. The soldiers would often look to other sources of food to satisfy their appetite. Dr. Halbert Lewis, a Stevens Point area dentist serving in the 132nd Division Medical Corps, commented on the scarcity of food.
"Since we have been here, haven't had an egg to eat. It's awful hard to get things like that here.
Many soldiers felt forced to buy food from the locals at high prices just to get that taste of home. While freshly cooked food may taste like home, every soldier's only direct interaction with home were the letters they exchanged with their families. However, the post was riddled with problems. For one, the letters sent home from the front that had contained locations or battle plans were censored to avoid revealing secrets to the enemy if the letters were intercepted. Not only did soldiers have difficulty telling their families about their experiences, but the postal service was very inconsistent. It would take so long to send letters from one place to another that sometimes a soldier would receive dozens of letters at once. Despite the issues with the post, writing letters to home was a soldier's favorite pastime. Letters were popular because there was very little for a soldier to do when not on duty. After long hours of sitting around, waiting for something to happen, boredom quickly set in.
Myron is sitting right side of me, also writing home, but every once in a while, he and I give a deep sigh and wish we were back in Stevens Point. But every other soldier here wishes that, and when we all do go back, I'll say it with the happiest bunch of men in the world.
Lieutenant Frank Heyer, a Stevens Point soldier serving with the 32nd Infantry Division, yearned to see the front.
This life is getting awful quiet now, and I'm aching to get into the real game.
The military tried to counteract this problem by bringing over bands to play for the troops or allowing soldiers to leave the base and explore nearby towns during their downtime. A very popular destination was the local YMCA, which would play the troops' movies and sell them cigarettes. While these diversions would brighten a soldier's day, most of their time still consisted of backbreaking work, followed by many hours of boredom. Carl Jacobs wrote,
I'm glad that I was sent out, as I would rather be busy while waiting to go home than to lay around with nothing but an hour's drill every day.
Even during their long stretches of boredom, the threat of shelling, gas attacks, or assault was always present. In order to prevent any unnecessary casualties, the military ordered extensive drilling to make sure the troops were prepared for any situation.
Had a gas alarm the other night. Great stuff, putting on that gas mask in the pitch dark, and it's supposed to be done in 6 seconds.
These drills, while ensuring the troops would be ready for any attack, kept reminding them it all could end in the blink of an eye and at any time. Guy Gross, a Stevens Point soldier who was seriously wounded by a gas attack, wrote home,
It had rained somewhat during the day and the ground was damp, which has a tendency to hold the gases. There were a couple of Frenchmen in the dugout who said they didn't think there was enough gas to hurt anything, but it turns out they were badly mistaken. They were gassed out too.
Average life on the front was a struggle. The men faced unpredictable weather, poor sleeping conditions, mediocre food, inconsistent news from home, and the soul-crushing boredom, while the threat of attack loomed over their heads. All of these hardships left many soldiers demoralized. Nothing could prepare these farm boys for the horror and carnage that war brings. The majority of the U.S. soldiers entering World War I were close to the age of 18 or older, but have not seen combat. While a lot of soldiers were excited to go overseas and fight, the majority of them were untrained and had no idea what war was like. Soldiers described what their frontline experiences were like through letters to home. One soldier described horrors that most soldiers experience while trying to rest. Ellis, a soldier from central Wisconsin, wrote,
We have been visited every night lately by German bombing planes, which drop bombs all around here.
Eagleberger wrote about a fellow soldier,
He has lost 3 brothers since 1914, and from the number of scars upon him, it's a wonder he hasn't followed them. His latest injury was from gas, and he has a throat hideous to look into. He was called back into service at the beginning of the spring drive, and I haven't heard of or from him since.
After living on the front, the realities of combat were setting in. Peterson, a soldier from central Wisconsin, described,
We advanced through some country a week or so ago where the dead, both Americans and Germans, were lying on fields everywhere. The sights were surely horrible, with the death and destruction everywhere, together with the cold, rain, and mud, and the intense shell fire. It sure is no snap, but we have had almost a year of it now, so you see, we are getting to be quite some old vets.
Likewise, Eagleberger tried to make sense of what he had witnessed.
Try and imagine that trip. Here we are, every one of us green men, walking along that road in the dark and the guide pointing out shell holes deep enough to bury all 6 of us in. I admit it rather sent the shivers up and down my spine, but I managed to keep a stiff upper lip anyway. One could see our creeping barrage, perhaps 100 yards ahead of them. Right up they went, with never a one faltering. They reached the woods all right, with fewer men than they started with, but they kept right on and on. It was wonderful and gruesome too, but it fascinated a person.
Although censorship during the war meant that many details of battle remained unsaid, letters still revealed the horrors of war. Many of these men would suffer gruesome injuries from bullets, shrapnel, gas, and bayonets.
Dear Mother, a week ago this morning, a Bosch high explosive and your son got pretty severely tangled up for a while. I don't know how close the shell actually came to me, but I can readily tell just what effect it produces personally. One fragment tore in just above my right knee, missing the bone. One in the upper inside left leg, missing the bone, no damage. Another well up on the leg, missing the bone, and another through the upper left arm, missing the cone and lodging on the surface of my chest. Just enough force to stick on the surface and not do anything the least injury.
Wisconsin soldiers also recalled vividly the deaths of their foes, and many developed a hatred of their German enemies. Peterson recalled vividly the deaths of German pilots.
There have been quite a few enemy planes brought down in the vicinity lately. One was brought down just a little way from here with 2 men in it. One of them jumped when they were halfway down, and the other was burned to a crisp.
Lewis explains,
We captured them all right, but too many died along the road. We lost about 8,000 in our division. That includes wounded and death also.
although Americans were only involved in the Great War for less than 2 years, Wisconsin soldiers on the front lines witnessed devastation that shattered their pre-war mentalities. Soldiers from Wisconsin on their way to fight in World War I were nothing short of enthusiastic. They were motivated to get out and see the world. They had no idea what was in store for them. As the men realized the war was not going to end anytime soon, they became distraught and their enthusiasm deteriorated. They began to miss their families and couldn't wait to be back in Wisconsin.
Money is worth nothing up here. Give me a mirror to look into to convince me that I have lived through it, and that is enough.
Once the realities of warfare hit, many soldiers experienced a change in attitude. Those who were bored still wished to be part of the battle on the front. Those who had put their time in on the front were ready to be done with the constant worry and combat. Lieutenant Drips, stationed in France, expressed his desire to be active on the front in a letter sent home.
I have applied to take an examination for lieutenant in the regular army and am waiting for word from headquarters. If I get that, I will probably be sent to the front, and that's where I'm hoping to go.
In contrast to Drip's enthusiasm, several soldiers just wanted to return home.
I am sure sick of Europe and all that goes with it. This waiting, I think, is the hardest part of the war.
With constant battle or military duties, these hardworking men often did not have a large amount of time for reflection. Soldiers that were not in battle had duties that required most days' attention. When these men did have time to think, their thoughts were of those at home. Many men longed to be home with their loved ones, and emotions began to shift or become stronger. Some men began to realize that the annihilation of battlefield land was home to their allies and showed pity to their foreign comrades.
Can you imagine any family in France enjoying life after nearly 4 years of this bloodshed with no definite idea of when relief will come? Let us hope that there will be something left for them to enjoy, even after the end has come. And let us hope that the next struggle in which we expect to figure will bring about the end.
Throughout World War I, soldiers experienced a wide range of emotions. Not only were these soldiers fighting for those next to them in the trenches, but for the people of France and all of the Allies. The European families were the ones who lost the most: farms, houses, and children.
Can realize what war is now that I have seen some of the awful destruction that has taken place. In one village that you have read of, there is hardly a single wall that remains intact.
Soldiers waited for battle or thought about what was to come next. A soldier passing through these cities of war witnessed the streets filled with dead soldiers and civilians. The thought of these lifeless bodies being a friend, or even the soldier himself, stayed in the back of their minds. Cities were demolished, leaving little hope for the innocent civilians who were trapped during these bombings or for those in the cities following. All that could be done was continue to train and follow the next order, waiting for the opportunity to strike against those who had done this to so many people. Those who felt fortunate enough to actually be in combat did not hold back. Gross described his feelings.
I couldn't rest as my eyes commenced to smart something fierce, and by morning I was blind as a bat and had to be led to the auto that took us to the hospital. I was unable to see at all for 4 days, but can see almost as good now as ever, thanks to our Red Cross nurses. The treatment we are receiving is sure great. It couldn't be better. My face and lower part of my body is burned somewhat, but is coming along dandy. About 60 of the boys of Old Company E were gassed. 2 of them have died from the effects, and a couple of them are in very serious condition. Now, dearest folks, do not worry about me at all, for by the time you receive this, I'll be well and out of the hospital, ready, if they will let me, to pay the Germans back good and proper for the way they've made us suffer with their mustard gas.
With all the different emotions experienced by soldiers in World War I, revenge was the scariest. The rage, the feeling of not being able to handle the deceased, destruction, and physical mental strains, the war took its toll, and soldiers were ready to get back at German soldiers for the damage they had done on the Allies. Increased exposure to traumatic events or negative actions could lead to the detachment of soldiers during the war. If the threat of a soldier's life and the difficulties endured during warfare were not enough to cause this, the visual of injuries and dead bodies would. This detachment was reflected in soldiers writing to their loved ones, as one moment they would be discussing the weather and their day-to-day life, and next would mention the sight of a dead body. This was due to the fact that soldiers' minds were trained to separate emotional responses to sights that would have earlier made anyone's stomach churn.
How I would love to climb into a good bathtub tonight. Had a bath swim in Bloody Marne the other day, and just as we got all through, along came a dead German down the stream.
Soldiers got used to the sight of dead bodies. To some, gore had lost its effect. Detachment, however, did not always come in such extreme measures. Burns, a central Wisconsin soldier, mentioned,
"Am more afraid of them than I am of bombs, because what goes up must come down, and one high explosive shell did not after going off in the air. Whenever a machine gun comes over now and I am asleep or in bed, I never give it a thought."
One could be desensitized to many different aspects of war, especially when sleep was needed to re-energize for the next day of war.
Friday, I was on duty at the post where shells were flying, and I have had the experience of hearing them sing and then crouching to suspense until they exploded. It isn't a pleasant experience, and even when we are in the abri, we don't feel exactly comfortable. As if a shell should strike squarely on the top, we should be buried alive.
These fears quickly shifted as soldiers became numb to the features of battles and spoke softly of their experiences. As the emotions of soldiers changed, they became desensitized to combat. Detachment was a large part of warfare, and although ultimately soldiers were able to discuss their lives and war together, the effects were not good for these soldiers' mental health. During combat, many saw their fellow soldiers and friends perish. The constant worry of being the next to be injured or killed weighed heavily on their minds. Due to the constant stress of war, soldiers may have entertained the hope of being injured to be relieved of duty.
They talk about the event as though it were going to the summer vacation, with all expenses paid. Have no fear for the consequences. In fact, they take a good look at our ambulances, and I know they are praying that they may come home, back with me or Don on the stretcher.
While they were living in a nightmare every day, it was not until after they were sent home that the mental wounds began to show. Many of these soldiers came back knowing they would never be the same again. This trauma often led to mental health disorders such as post-traumatic stress disorder, known back then as shell shock, during World War I. Prior to World War I, mental illness developed due to warfare was treated with disdain. Walters, a soldier stationed in Europe, went into detail about the mental health of the men overseas in a letter to home.
The majority are fine fellows whom it appears will soon be normal or nearly so. One of them, as classy fellow who has been in the thick of the work, stated that shell shock would show up more after the men get back than at the time of the real work, as there is many a man fighting like a madman, or was, who would give out when the excitement was over. The worst was dreaming of the terrible scenes one had witnessed, resulting in the veritable nightmares.
At the start of the war, central Wisconsin residents and the rest of the U.S. entered with a lot of suspense. Everyone saw this as an opportunity to possibly change their lives forever. The reality of the Great War set in quickly, and the personal sacrifices families made weighed just as heavy as the celebration of a victorious war effort. For those that were able to return home to the heart of the dairy state, it was a much different day-to-day life, and that year-and-a-half experience changed the mentalities of these easygoing blue-collar folks. The initial angst, suspense, and taste of victory gave the American citizens back home a thrill of dominance and reckoning, but those returning home immediately after the war paid a dark price that they had invested into for the rest of their remaining days. Through these prominent letters, like those from Charles and Sheldon McCready, Carl Jacobs, and others who served, we can better understand their experiences and the lasting effects of war. Even 100 years later, those from central Wisconsin who served in World War I will always be remembered, and their legacy will never be forgotten.